The chest pain hit me like a freight train in the middle of Target, and when I called my husband sobbing that I thought I was having a heart attack, he said, "Can't this wait? I'm having dinner with clients." That's when I knew my 32-year marriage was already dead. I just hadn't signed the death certificate yet. You know, they say you learn someone's true character in a crisis. Well, let me tell you about the night I learned that the man I'd devoted 3 decades of my life to valued a business dinner more than my actual life. But more importantly, let me tell you about how that revelation became the catalyst for the most empowering decision I've ever made. I'm 61 years old, and for 32 years, I believed that being a good wife meant putting everyone else's needs before my own. I believed that love meant sacrifice, that marriage meant compromise, and that a woman's worth was measured by how well she served her family. I used to think that asking for help was selfish, that expecting support was needy, and that a heart attack in the checkout line of Target was just an inconvenience to be managed quietly. But that was before I spent 4 hours alone in the emergency room, clutching my chest and wondering if I was going to die while my husband finished his surf and turf with potential investors. That was before I realized that the man who promised to love me in sickness and in health had already made his choice about which one mattered more. My name is Eleanor, though Richard always called me Ellie in that slightly condescending way that made my full name sound too formal, too much. For 32 years I answered to Ellie, cooked his meals, managed his calendar, raised our 2 children, and built my entire identity around being Mrs. Richard Hoffman. I was the wife who never complained, the mother who never said no, and the woman who disappeared so completely into her roles that I forgot I was ever anything else. We met when I was 29 and he was 35. Both of us working at a mid-sized accounting firm in downtown Chicago. I was a senior accountant with a corner office and a growing reputation for turning around troubled client portfolios. Richard was a partner, charming and ambitious, with a corner office twice the size of mine and a smile that made me feel like the most important person in the room. When he asked me to dinner, I thought I was the luckiest woman in the building. The courtship was a whirlwind of expensive restaurants and weekend getaways, of flowers delivered to my office and jewelry that made my colleagues whisper with envy. He was everything I thought I wanted. Successful, confident, and completely devoted to making me feel special. When he proposed after 8 months, I said yes before he finished asking the question. "You'll quit the firm after we marry, of course," he said over champagne that night, and it didn't even sound like a question. "I make enough for both of us, and I want you to focus on making our home perfect. I want to come home to my wife, not another accountant." I remember feeling flattered that he wanted to take care of me, that he saw our future as something he could provide for completely. I was tired of the corporate grind, tired of fighting for recognition in a male-dominated field, tired of proving myself every single day. The idea of being taken care of having my worth measured by love instead of billable hours, felt like a gift. So I quit. I gave up my corner office, my client portfolio, and my financial independence to become Mrs. Richard Hoffman, full-time wife and future mother. At the time it felt like a promotion. Looking back, I can see it was the first step in a 32-year process of making myself smaller and smaller until I nearly disappeared entirely. The first few years were blissful, or at least they felt that way. We bought a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in Winnetka, and I threw myself into making it perfect. I learned to cook gourmet meals, organize charity fundraisers, and decorated every room with the kind of magazine-perfect attention to detail that made other wives ask for my secrets. When our daughter Sarah was born, followed by our son Michael 2 years later, I felt like my life was finally complete. Richard was a good provider, I'll give him that. The money flowed steadily, the house was always warm, and the children never wanted for anything. But somewhere in those early years of diapers and dinner parties, I started to notice that being taken care of and being valued weren't the same thing. When I suggested returning to work part-time after Michael started school, Richard laughed it off. "Why would you want to do that? You have everything you need right here." When I mentioned maybe taking some accounting classes to keep my skills current, he frowned and said, "Don't you think your time would be better spent on the house? The landscaping needs work, and you promised to organize that fundraiser for Sarah's school." When I brought up the idea of starting my own small bookkeeping business from home, he got genuinely irritated. "Ellie, we've discussed this. I work so you don't have to. Focus on being a wife and mother." And I did focus. I focused so hard that I forgot I had ever been anything else. I became the perfect wife, the ideal mother, the woman who anticipated everyone's needs before they even knew they had them. I scheduled Richard's medical appointments and remembered his mother's birthday. I coordinated carpools and coached Little League. I managed the household finances, though Richard insisted on keeping the major accounts in his name only. For tax purposes, he always said, though I knew enough about taxes to know that was nonsense. The children grew up calling me for everything and Richard for nothing. When Sarah had her heart broken at 16, she cried on my shoulder for hours. When Michael struggled with math, I spent my evenings tutoring him at the kitchen table. When either of them needed money for school trips or college applications or cars, they came to me, and I somehow always made it work within the household budget Richard allocated to me each month. Richard, meanwhile, worked longer hours and traveled more frequently. Business dinners became a regular occurrence, weekend golf games were non-negotiable, and annual golf trips with college friends were sacred obligations. When I occasionally suggested that maybe we could travel together, he'd remind me that his business trips weren't vacations, and that someone needed to hold down the fort at home. Besides, he'd say with that indulgent smile, you hate flying and you'd be bored at all the business functions. You're much happier here with your garden and your book club. And somehow I convinced myself that he was right. I did hate flying. When had I decided that? I would be bored at business functions, wouldn't I? I was happier at home, wasn't I? The questions that might have challenged these assumptions got buried under the daily demands of managing everyone else's happiness. When the children left for college, I expected things to change. I thought maybe Richard and I would rediscover each other, travel together, find new shared interests. Instead, the house got quieter and his absences got longer. Without the children as a bridge between us, I started to notice how little we actually had to say to each other. You should take up pottery, he suggested when I mentioned feeling restless, or maybe watercolors. Joan's wife loves her art classes. I was thinking more about going back to work, I said carefully. Maybe part-time just to have something. At your age. He didn't even look up from his newspaper. Ellie, you haven't worked in decades. Who would hire you? The words hit me like a slap, but I swallowed the hurt and told myself he was being practical, not cruel. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was too old, too out of touch, too removed from the professional world to be anything other than what I'd become. But the restlessness didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I started paying closer attention to Richard's schedule, noticing patterns I'd overlooked before. The business dinners that ran until midnight. The weekend meetings that couldn't be postponed. The way he guarded his phone and laptop like state secrets. You're being paranoid, I told myself when I started wondering about the secretary who called the house and hung up when I answered. You're being insecure, I whispered when I noticed the credit card charges for restaurants I'd never been to and hotels in cities where he claimed to have no business. But paranoia and insecurity have a way of sharpening your observation skills. I started noticing things that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The way he talked to me like I was slightly dim, but charming in my simplicity. The way he made decisions about our life without consulting me, then presented them as foregone conclusions. The way he'd pat my hand when I tried to join conversations about business or politics, as if my opinion was cute but irrelevant. That's not really your area, sweetheart, became his standard response to anything that ventured beyond domestic concerns. When I tried to discuss the fluctuating stock market, he'd smile indulgently and change the subject to the weather. When I mentioned an article I'd read about tax policy, he'd nod politely and ask what I was planning for dinner. I started to feel like I was disappearing, becoming more transparent with each passing year. At social gatherings, other wives would introduce themselves to me multiple times, as if I were so forgettable that even people who'd known me for years couldn't quite place me. I was Richard's wife, Sarah, and Michael's mother, but I wasn't Eleanor anymore. I wasn't sure I remembered who Eleanor was. The heart attack changed everything, but not in the way you might think. It wasn't the medical crisis itself that opened my eyes. It was Richard's response to it. Or rather, his complete lack of response. It was a Tuesday evening in October, unseasonably warm for Chicago. I was at Target picking up dry cleaning and browsing the home goods section, looking for new throw pillows for the living room. Richard was at what he called a crucial business dinner, with potential investors, something he'd mentioned casually that morning as if it were just another item on his calendar. I was examining a set of navy blue pillows with gold trim when the pain hit. It started as a dull ache in my chest, like heartburn after eating too quickly. But within minutes, it felt like someone was sitting on my chest with the weight of a car. The pain radiated down my left arm and up into my jaw, and suddenly I couldn't catch my breath. I knew exactly what was happening. My father had died of a heart attack when I was 35, and my mother had described his symptoms in vivid detail. The crushing chest pain, the difficulty breathing, the sense of impending doom that medical professionals call a classic symptom, but that feels like the end of the world when you're experiencing it. I fumbled for my phone with trembling hands and called Richard. It rang 4 times before he answered, and I could hear the clink of glasses and murmur of conversation in the background. "Ellie? This isn't a great time." "Richard," I gasped, still gripping the shopping cart for support. "I think I'm having a heart attack. I'm at Target and I can't breathe in my chest." "A heart attack?" His voice was irritated, not concerned. "Are you sure? You had that heartburn last week, remember? Did you take your antacid?" "This isn't heartburn," I whispered, because speaking at full volume felt impossible. "Richard, I need you to come get me. I need to go to the hospital." There was a pause and I could hear him moving away from the table, probably stepping outside or into a quieter area of the restaurant. When he spoke again, his voice was the patient tone he used when he thought I was being dramatic. "Ellie, honey, I'm in the middle of a very important dinner." I stood there in the middle of Target, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with my heart. "Richard, I think I'm dying." "You're not dying," he said firmly, as if he could diagnose me over the phone from 20 miles away. "You're having anxiety. You know how you get when I'm working late. Just go home and take one of your sleeping pills. We'll talk when I get back." "But what if?" "Ellie, I have to go. These investors are waiting for me. Drive carefully and don't stay up worrying. Everything's fine." He hung up. I stood there staring at my phone, chest still crushing inward, arms still aching, and realized that I was completely alone. Not just in that moment but in a much deeper way that I'd been avoiding acknowledging for years. A young store employee with a red vest and concerned eyes approached me. "Ma'am? Are you okay? You look really pale." "I think I need an ambulance," I whispered. That employee, whose name tag read Jessica, and who couldn't have been more than 19 years old, showed me more care and concern in the next 10 minutes than my husband had shown me in 32 years of marriage. She called 911, stayed with me until the paramedics arrived, and even followed the ambulance to the hospital to make sure I wasn't alone. The emergency room at Northwestern Memorial was bright and efficient, full of people having the worst days of their lives while medical professionals worked with calm competence to make those days survivable. I was rushed through triage, connected to monitors that beeped and hummed with electronic reassurance, and given an EKG that confirmed what I already knew. I was having a heart attack. "Is your husband on his way?" the nurse asked as she started in 4. "He's at a business dinner," I said, and heard how pathetic that sounded even as the words left my mouth. "Well, I'm sure he'll be here soon," she said kindly, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. What kind of husband doesn't drop everything when his wife is having a heart attack? The kind who's been treating that wife like an inconvenience for decades, that's what kind. I spent the next 4 hours in that hospital bed, watching the monitors trace the rhythm of my damaged heart, waiting for Richard to walk through the door. I called him 3 more times. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second time he answered and said, "Ellie, I told you I can't talk right now. Stop calling." The third call, around midnight, he answered with obvious irritation. "What now?" "I'm in the hospital," I said quietly. "I had a heart attack. They say it was mild, but they want to keep me overnight for observation." There was a long pause. Then, "Well, that's good that it was mild. What time do they think you'll be discharged tomorrow?" "I have that conference call with the Singapore office at 10-inch. I closed my eyes and felt 32 years of marriage crystallize into perfect, devastating clarity. "I don't know what time they'll discharge me, Richard." "Well, call me when you know. If it's after 10, you'll need to take a cab home. I can't reschedule this call. Too many time zones involved. Glad you're okay. Get some rest." He hung up again. I lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the beeps and hums of machines that cared more about keeping me alive than my own husband did, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't grief exactly or even anger. It was clarity. Cold, clean, absolute clarity. For 32 years, I had been married to a man who saw me as a convenience. I cooked his meals, managed his household, raised his children, and maintained his social calendar. When I was useful, I was appreciated in the same way someone might appreciate a reliable appliance. When I needed something, support, attention, basic human care during a medical emergency, I was an inconvenience to be managed. The nurse who checked on me around 2 in the morning found me wide awake, staring at the ceiling with what must have been a strange expression on my face. "Can't sleep?" she asked gently. "The medications can sometimes make people restless." "No," I said slowly. "I think I'm waking up." She looked at me with the kind of professional concern that probably came from years of dealing with people having existential crises during medical emergencies. "Would you like me to call someone? A family member or friend?" I thought about that question for a long moment. Who would I call? My children lived across the country, building their own lives, and I didn't want to worry them with late-night phone calls about medical emergencies that were already being managed. My sister lived in Florida and had her own health problems. My book club friends were lovely women, but we didn't have the kind of relationships where you called each other from hospital beds. The truth was, I had built my entire social network around Richard. His friends' wives, his colleagues' families, his business contacts, and their social circles. I had no independent friendships, no separate support system, no life that existed outside the parameters of being Mrs. Richard Hoffman. "No," I told the nurse. "There's no one to call." That might have been the most devastating realization of all. Not that my husband had abandoned me during a heart attack, but that I had allowed myself to become so completely dependent on him that there was literally no one else in my life who would care if I lived or died. I was discharged the next afternoon with a prescription for cardiac medication, instructions for lifestyle changes, and a follow-up appointment with a cardiologist. Richard picked me up at 3:30, after his conference call was finished, and spent the drive home talking about the Singapore deal and how my little emergency had made him look unprofessional when he had to step away from dinner the night before. "You really need to learn to manage your anxiety better," he said as we pulled into our driveway. "Stress isn't good for your heart, and frankly, it's not good for my work either." Over the next few weeks, as I recovered from what my cardiologist confirmed was indeed a mild heart attack caused by stress and genetic predisposition, I started paying attention to my life in a way I hadn't done in decades. Not the surface details, the meals to cook, the appointments to manage, the social obligations to fulfill, but the underlying structure of how I lived and who I had become. I realized that I had spent 32 years in a marriage where I was expected to be grateful for basic shelter and financial support, while providing unlimited emotional labor, domestic service, and social facilitation in return. I had been an employee disguised as a wife, with no benefits, no vacation time, and no option to quit. But the heart attack had shown me something even more disturbing. I wasn't just an underappreciated employee. I was a completely disposable one. When I was literally dying, Richard's primary concern was how my crisis might inconvenience his schedule. When I needed him most, he was not just absent, he was annoyed by my need. That level of callousness doesn't develop overnight. It's the result of years of small cruelties, tiny dismissals, and constant reinforcement of the idea that my needs were secondary to everyone else's. I had been so focused on being a good wife that I'd never noticed I was married to a bad husband. The clarity was devastating, but it was also liberating. For the first time in decades, I started thinking about what I wanted instead of what everyone else expected from me. I started remembering the woman I used to be before I became Mrs. Richard Hoffman, and wondering what she might have accomplished if she'd never learned to make herself smaller. I remembered Eleanor the accountant, who had a corner office and a growing reputation. Eleanor who could analyze a troubled portfolio and find solutions that saved clients thousands of dollars. Eleanor who negotiated her own salary and took pride in her professional competence. Eleanor who had dreams of starting her own firm someday, before she got distracted by the romance of being taken care of. That Eleanor was still in here somewhere, buried under 32 years of diminished expectations and accumulated resentment. And she was furious. I started going through our financial records, something I hadn't done in years. Richard handled all the major accounts, the investments, the retirement planning. I managed the household budget and wrote checks for groceries and utilities, but I had no idea what our actual net worth was, or how our assets were structured. What I found was both better and worse than I expected. Richard had been a good provider in terms of accumulating wealth. We had substantial savings, a well-funded retirement account, and the house was completely paid off. But everything, literally everything, was in his name only. The savings accounts, the investment portfolio, even the deed to the house I'd spent 32 years making into a home. I had no legal claim to any of it, despite being married for over 3 decades. In Illinois, that didn't matter for divorce purposes. Marital assets were still marital assets regardless of whose name was on the accounts. But it mattered for everything else. I couldn't access our savings if Richard decided to be vindictive. I couldn't make financial decisions about investments or expenditures. I couldn't even refinance our mortgage if I wanted to because legally it wasn't my house. I had spent 32 years building a life that belonged entirely to someone else. That night, I lay in bed next to Richard, listening to him snore softly, and realized I was planning my escape. Not consciously, not in any detailed way, but some part of my brain had already started calculating what it would take to leave. What I would need, what I was entitled to, what it would cost to start over at 61. The next morning I called my old firm. Eleanor Morrison? The receptionist sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me. I can't believe it. Hold on, let me see if Jack Patterson is available. He asks about you every time your name comes up in the alumni directory. Jack Patterson had been a junior associate when I left the firm, 20 years younger than me and eager to learn everything I could teach him about forensic accounting. He was a senior partner now, and when he came on the line, his voice was warm with genuine affection. Eleanor, what a wonderful surprise. How are you? How's married life treating you? It's complicated, I said carefully. Jack, I need some advice. Hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to get back into accounting after being out of the field for 30 years, what would that look like? There was a pause and I could practically hear him thinking. Jack had always been quick to read between the lines. Hypothetically? Well, accounting principles haven't changed that much, though the technology certainly has. Someone with your background and instincts could probably get up to speed in 6 months with the right training program. And honestly, Eleanor, there's a real demand for experienced forensic accountants, especially in divorce cases. Lots of people trying to hide assets these days. Forensic accounting in divorce cases, I repeated slowly. Oh yes, it's become a real specialty. Highly paid too because you're basically detective work with spreadsheets, finding hidden bank accounts, tracking asset transfers, proving income underreporting. Right up your alley, I think. I felt something stir in my chest that I hadn't experienced in decades. Professional excitement. The thrill of a challenging puzzle that required skill and intelligence to solve. What would it take to get trained in that kind of work? There are certification programs. 6-month intensive courses that cover both the accounting and legal aspects. I could make some calls if you're serious about this, hypothetically or otherwise. Let me think about it, I said, but I was already thinking. I was already planning. After I hung up, I sat in my perfect kitchen in my perfect house and felt the first stirrings of hope I'd experienced in years. I could do this. I could rebuild a career, reclaim my professional identity, create a life that belonged to me instead of being an appendage to someone else's life. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was walking away from. I spent the next month becoming an expert on my own marriage. I tracked every account, every investment, every asset that Richard had accumulated during our 32 years together. I made copies of tax returns, bank statements, and insurance policies. I photographed important documents and stored digital copies in a cloud account that Richard didn't know existed. What I discovered was that we were worth approximately $23 million in combined assets. The house was valued at $850,000. Retirement accounts totaled just over $900,000. Investment portfolios and savings accounts made up the rest. In a divorce, I would be entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, minus whatever I might need to pay in legal fees. Even accounting for lawyer costs and the complications of disentangling 32 years of shared finances, I was looking at walking away with well over $1 million. Enough to buy a smaller house, fund my return to school, and provide a comfortable cushion while I rebuilt my career. I wasn't trapped by financial dependence. I was trapped by habit, fear, and the sunk cost fallacy of a 3-decade investment in a marriage that had stopped working years ago. The final revelation came 3 weeks after my heart attack, on a Saturday afternoon when Richard thought I was at book club. I had canceled book club to attend a divorce support group that met at the community center, curious about what the process might look like if I decided to pursue it. The support group was eye-opening, full of women who had stories remarkably similar to mine. Husbands who had gradually eroded their wives' independence. Women who had discovered that their partners valued them more as services than as people. Stories of emotional neglect, financial control, and the particular cruelty of men who abandoned their wives during medical emergencies. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't even unusual. When I came home around 4 o'clock, Richard's car was in the driveway even though he'd said he was playing golf until dinner. I parked on the street and walked quietly to the back of the house, planning to slip in through the kitchen door without disturbing whatever he was doing. What I heard through the sliding glass door leading to his home office stopped me cold. "No, I understand your concerns, but trust me, this is all going to work out perfectly." Richard's voice was warm and reassuring, the tone he used when he was trying to convince someone to trust him with something important. Ellie's heart attack was actually a blessing in disguise. Dr. Peterson says people who have cardiac events often have more of them within the first year. Stress, you know. And frankly, she's been under a lot of stress lately. My blood turned to ice water. I know it sounds cold, but we have to be practical about these things. She's 61, she's had a heart attack, and she has no independent income or assets. If something were to happen to her, everything would pass to me directly, and then to the kids eventually. Much cleaner than a divorce, which would cost us millions and drag on for years. I pressed myself against the wall next to the door, barely breathing. Sarah's already on board with the plan. I explained the financial realities to her, and she understands that maintaining her mother's lifestyle indefinitely isn't sustainable. Michael's a little more sentimental, but he'll come around when he sees the numbers. There was a pause, and I could hear him moving around the office, probably pacing the way he did when he was working through a complex problem. The key is managing her stress levels carefully. Too much, too fast, and it becomes obvious. But a steady diet of emotional pressure, financial insecurity, maybe some hints about how expensive her medical care is becoming. People with weak hearts don't tend to live very long under those conditions. I felt like I was going to vomit. Look, I'm not saying I want anything to happen to Ellie. She's been a good wife and I do care about her. But we have to be realistic. She's not the woman I married anymore. She's needy, anxious, and frankly, she's becoming a liability. If nature takes its course in the next year or two, everyone wins. The kids get their inheritance without the complications of divorce. I get to move on with my life. And Ellie doesn't have to face the humiliation of being a divorced woman with no skills and no prospects. Trust me, this is the kindest solution for everyone involved. I stood there listening to my husband of 32 years calmly plan my death with someone, presumably his lawyer, based on the tone of the conversation, and felt something inside me crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. Richard wasn't just neglectful or selfish. He was actively malicious. He had looked at my heart attack and seen an opportunity. He had calculated that my death would be more financially advantageous than my divorce, and he was taking steps to encourage that outcome. He thought my cardiac event was a gift that would solve his wife problem permanently. I listened for a few more minutes, hearing enough to understand that this wasn't a spontaneous conversation. This was a plan that had been developing for weeks, probably since the night I called him from Target. He had consulted lawyers, talked to our children, and developed a strategy for managing me out of existence. But there was one thing Richard had miscalculated. One crucial variable he hadn't accounted for in his careful planning. Eleanor the accountant was back, and she was absolutely furious. I slipped away from the house and drove to the nearest coffee shop, where I sat in my car and called Jack Patterson on his direct line. Eleanor? Twice in 1 month. I'm flattered. Jack, I said quietly, I need that referral for divorce attorneys. The best one, you know. Someone who specializes in complex asset division and... I paused, thinking about what I just overheard. Someone who's comfortable with forensic evidence and complicated legal strategies. Eleanor, what's going on? You sound different. I've remembered who I used to be, I said. And she's ready to go to war. Jack recommended Cindy Byrne, a divorce attorney with a reputation for taking on high-asset cases and winning them decisively. Cindy's office was in downtown Chicago, sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the financial district where I used to work. Cindy herself was younger than me, probably mid-40s, with short black hair and the kind of professional composure that radiated competence. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking for clarification about financial details or timeline specifics. When I finished, including the conversation I'd overheard about managing my stress levels until my heart gave out, she set down her pen and looked at me with something that might have been admiration. Mrs. Hoffman, in 20 years of practicing family law, I have never had a client come to me with such thoroughly documented evidence of financial assets and such clear documentation of spousal misconduct. You've essentially built our entire case already. I used to be an accountant, I said. I know how to track money and I know how to document evidence. More than that, she said, pulling out a digital recorder. I want you to go home and get more evidence of your husband's planning. If he's discussing strategies for hastening your death, I want it recorded. What you're describing isn't just grounds for divorce. It's potentially criminal. You want me to record him? Illinois is a one-party consent state. You can legally record any conversation you're a part of, and you can record conversations in your own home, even if you're not directly involved, as long as you're present on the property. If your husband is planning to essentially murder you through stress management, we need proof. I felt a thrill of professional satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in decades. This was problem-solving. This was strategy. This was using intelligence and skill to achieve a specific outcome. This was war and I was going to win. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a woman with a mission. I installed recording apps on my phone. I placed small digital recorders in Richard's office and our bedroom. I continued to play the role of the recovering heart attack victim, weak, independent, and easily managed, while systematically documenting every conversation that revealed his true intentions. Richard, believing that I was too fragile and passive to be a threat, spoke freely about his plans. He discussed his timeline with his lawyer, outlining a strategy of gradually increasing my stress levels while reducing my access to medical care. He talked to our children about the financial benefits of waiting for nature to take its course, rather than going through an expensive divorce. Most damning of all, he talked to someone I eventually realized was a woman named Jennifer, who worked as a patient advocate at a private medical practice, and who was apparently helping him find ways to interfere with my cardiac care. The key is making sure she doesn't get too comfortable with her current cardiologist, he told Jennifer during a conversation I recorded from the kitchen while he paced in his office. If she gets too settled with Dr. Martinez, she might start asking inconvenient questions about why her stress levels keep climbing despite the medication. I can arrange for Dr. Martinez to refer her to a colleague who's more flexible about treatment protocols, Jennifer replied. Someone who might be less aggressive about stress management or medication adjustments. It's not uncommon for cardiac patients to fall through the cracks during care transitions. Perfect. And you're sure this won't leave any paper trails that could be problematic later? Physician referrals happen all the time. No one questions them, and patients rarely understand enough about their own care to know when they're being managed poorly. I listened to my husband and his accomplice plan my medical murder, and felt absolutely no emotion except cold professional satisfaction. They were digging their own graves with every word, and I was documenting every shovelful of dirt. But I wasn't content to simply collect evidence. I wanted to understand the full scope of Richard's betrayal, to see how deep his callousness ran and how long this had been developing. I started paying attention to our social interactions differently, watching how he presented our marriage to friends and colleagues. What I saw was a man who had been laying the groundwork for my irrelevance for years. At dinner parties, he would make fond but condescending references to my little anxieties and my fragile health. He would share amusing anecdotes about my domestic mishaps and emotional overreactions, always with a tone of patient tolerance that positioned him as the long-suffering husband of a slightly unstable wife. "Ellie's been having a hard time since her heart attack," he told our neighbors the Hendersons at their anniversary party. "She's become very dependent, very fearful. I think the medical trauma really shook her confidence. She's always calling me at work now, worried about every little ache and pain." Mrs. Henderson made sympathetic noises, but I caught the look she exchanged with her husband. It was the expression of people who were already writing me off as the anxious invalid wife who would soon become Richard's tragic burden. "I keep telling her that stress is the worst thing for her heart," Richard continued, placing a protective hand on my shoulder that felt like a weight. "But she can't seem to stop worrying about everything. Yesterday she had a panic attack because she thought she smelled gas in the kitchen. Turned out she'd just forgotten to turn off the stove after making tea." That was a lie. I had never forgotten to turn off the stove, and I had never called him at work about medical concerns. But the Hendersons nodded knowingly, and I realized that Richard had been crafting this narrative for weeks, possibly months. He was creating a public record of my mental deterioration, my increasing dependence, my transformation from capable wife to burdensome invalid. When people heard that I had died from another heart attack, they would nod sadly and say they weren't surprised. Poor Ellie had been struggling so much since her first episode. Richard had tried so hard to take care of her, but sometimes these things were just inevitable. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Richard wasn't just planning to kill me. He was planning to make my death seem like a mercy to everyone who knew us. But two could play the long game, and I had 32 years of experience reading Richard's strategies. I started my own campaign of careful narrative construction. At book club, I mentioned casually that I was thinking about taking some accounting courses to keep my mind sharp during recovery. "Richard thinks it's a wonderful idea," I said, which was true in the sense that Richard thought any activity that might stress me was wonderful. He's always supported my intellectual pursuits. To the neighbors, I mentioned that Richard had been working so hard lately, traveling more frequently, staying out later. "I worry about him," I said with genuine wifely concern. "He's been under tremendous pressure since his promotion, and he doesn't take care of himself the way he should." I started volunteering at the hospital where I'd had my heart attack, helping with patient advocacy and administrative work. It put me in contact with medical professionals who could witness my competence and mental stability, and it gave me a legitimate reason to understand healthcare systems and patient rights. Most importantly, I started building relationships that existed outside of Richard's influence. I reconnected with college friends through social media. I joined a hiking group for cardiac rehabilitation. I began attending a financial planning seminar for women, where I met other wives who were starting to question their own financial dependence. I was creating witnesses to my recovery, my competence, and my growing independence. When the time came to act, I would have a network of people who could testify that Eleanor Hoffman was not a fragile invalid, but a woman who was reclaiming her strength. Meanwhile, I continued to collect evidence of Richard's planning. The recordings were damning, but I wanted more. I wanted to understand how deep this conspiracy went and who else might be involved. The answer came during Thanksgiving dinner with our children. Sarah and Michael had both come home for the holiday, and I was looking forward to seeing them despite the complicated circumstances. I hadn't seen either of them since my heart attack, and I was curious about how much they knew about their father's plans. The answer became clear within the first hour. Sarah, now 30 and a successful marketing executive in Seattle, arrived with a careful expression of concern that felt more practiced than genuine. She hugged me gently, as if I might break, and asked detailed questions about my medications and dietary restrictions. "Dad told us you've been having a really hard time," she said as we worked together in the kitchen, preparing the meal I had cooked for 32 consecutive years. "He's worried about you becoming too dependent on him." "Dependent how?" I asked carefully, continuing to chop vegetables with steady hands. "Well, calling him at work all the time, worrying about every little symptom. He says you've been having panic attacks and forgetting things around the house." Sarah's voice carried a note of gentle reproach, as if she were talking to a child who needed to try harder to be good. I set down my knife and looked at my daughter, my firstborn, whom I had nursed through countless childhood illnesses, helped with homework every night for 12 years, and supported through her college heartbreaks and career struggles. Sarah, I said quietly, I have never called your father at work about medical concerns. I have never had a panic attack. And I have never forgotten to turn off the stove or any other appliance in this house. She paused in her potato peeling, but she didn't look at me. Mom, sometimes people don't realize when they're having memory issues or anxiety problems. It's very common after cardiac events. Who told you that? Dad showed us some articles about post-cardiac depression and anxiety. And honestly, Mom, some of the things you've been saying and doing lately have been concerning. What things? Sarah set down her peeler and turned to face me with an expression of patient concern that was so familiar I wanted to scream. It was the exact expression Richard used when he was explaining why my perceptions couldn't be trusted. The paranoia about Dad's work schedule. The sudden interest in taking accounting classes when you haven't worked in 30 years. The way you've been asking questions about finances and insurance policies. Dad thinks you might be having some cognitive issues related to your heart medication. I felt the world tilt slightly the way it had in the Target checkout line, but this time it wasn't my heart failing. It was the devastating realization that my own daughter had been recruited into the campaign to gaslight me into an early grave. Sarah, I said very calmly, do you want me to die? She stepped back as if I'd slapped her. Mom, what a horrible thing to say. Of course I don't want you to die. We all want you to get better. What does getting better look like to you? Learning to manage your anxiety, not putting so much stress on Dad, maybe talking to a therapist about adjusting to your new health realities. The words sounded rehearsed, like talking points she'd memorized from someone else's script. And if I don't get better? If I continue to be anxious and dependent and burdensome? Sarah's face flushed, and for a moment I saw the calculation in her eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of her father. Mom, no one thinks you're burdensome. But we do think you need to be realistic about what your life looks like now. You're not young anymore and you've had a serious health scare. Maybe it's time to think about what kind of care you might need going forward. What kind of care? Well, there are very nice assisted living facilities that specialize in cardiac patients. Places where you could have medical supervision and social activities, without putting the burden of constant worry on Dad. I stared at my daughter and realized that Richard hadn't just been planning my death. He'd been planning my institutionalization as a backup option. If stress management didn't kill me quickly enough, he would have me declared incompetent and warehoused in a facility where my protests about his treatment would be dismissed as symptoms of cardiac-related dementia. Has your father discussed putting me in assisted living? Sarah's face told me everything I needed to know before she opened her mouth. He's mentioned that it might be something to consider if your anxiety doesn't improve. Mom, he's trying to take care of you. We all are. I turned back to my vegetables and continued chopping, each cut precise and controlled despite the rage building in my chest like steam in a pressure cooker. What about Michael? I asked casually. Does he agree with this assessment? Michael's always been more emotional about family stuff, but Dad's helping him understand the practical realities. We can't let sentiment cloud our judgment when it comes to your care and Dad's well-being. My younger child, whom I had rocked to sleep every night until he was 7, whom I had driven to soccer practice and band concerts and college orientation, had been convinced that managing me out of existence was a practical necessity. When Michael arrived that evening, I saw the same careful concern in his eyes, the same practiced gentleness that felt more like pity than love. He was 2 years younger than Sarah but had always been more intuitive, more emotionally connected to the family dynamics. If Richard had managed to convince Michael that I was a problem to be solved, then the campaign against me was more sophisticated than I had imagined. During dinner, I watched my family with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Richard played the role of the devoted but overwhelmed husband, sharing anecdotes about my episodes and confusion, with just the right tone of loving concern. Sarah and Michael reinforced his narrative with their own observations about my concerning behaviors and cognitive changes. I sat at the head of the table where I had presided over 32 years of family meals, listening to the 3 people I loved most in the world discuss my deteriorating mental state and the burden I was becoming to everyone around me. I think Mom would be much happier somewhere with structured activities and medical supervision, Sarah was saying. She seems so anxious here, so worried about being a bother. I've been researching facilities, Michael added. There's a really nice place in Evanston that specializes in cardiac rehabilitation and cognitive support. It's expensive, but Dad says cost isn't an issue if it means Mom gets the care she needs. Richard nodded gravely. The most important thing is Ellie's quality of life. I don't want her spending her remaining years feeling anxious and dependent. Remaining years was an interesting phrase choice. It implied a limited time frame, a clock that was already counting down. What do you think, Mom? Sarah asked with bright, false cheerfulness. Would you like to visit some of these places? Just to see what they're like. I looked around the table at these three people who had decided that I was too much trouble to keep around, and felt something settle into place in my chest that was harder and colder than any cardiac medication. I think, I said carefully, that I'd like to make my own decisions about my future. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah and Michael exchanged worried glances. Of course you'll be involved in any decisions, Richard said smoothly. But we want to make sure you have all the information you need to make good choices. Sometimes cardiac patients don't have the clearest perspective on their own limitations. Sometimes, I replied. People underestimate cardiac patients' ability to understand exactly what's happening around them. After dinner, while Richard and the children settled in the living room to watch football, I excused myself to rest in our bedroom. Instead, I activated the recording app on my phone and placed it in the hallway outside the living room, where it could capture their conversation through the open doorway. What I heard confirmed every suspicion I developed over the past month. She's getting worse, Sarah said. Did you see how paranoid she was during dinner? All those questions about our conversations with Dad. That weird comment about making her own decisions. I know. Michael's voice was heavy with what sounded like genuine sadness. It's hard to watch her deteriorating like this. The important thing is that we're all on the same page about what needs to happen, Richard said. If she continues to resist getting appropriate care, we may need to consider other options. What kind of other options? Michael asked. Legal guardianship. If we can demonstrate that her cardiac-related cognitive issues are making her unable to make rational decisions about her care, a court can grant me full authority to make those decisions for her. Is that really necessary? Michael sounded uncomfortable with the idea. Son, your mother is not the woman she used to be. The heart attack damaged more than just her cardiovascular system. She's becoming paranoid, accusatory, and increasingly unable to manage basic daily functions. If we don't intervene, she's going to hurt herself or someone else. Dad's right, Sarah said firmly. I've been doing research on cardiac-related dementia, and Mom is showing all the classic signs. Memory problems, personality changes, increased anxiety and paranoia. The kindest thing we can do is make sure she gets professional care before she degenerates further. And if she refuses to cooperate? Michael asked. Then we'll have to make the decision for her, Richard said. I've already talked to a lawyer about the guardianship process. It's not complicated when there's clear medical evidence of cognitive decline. What about the financial stuff? Sarah asked. I know Mom's been asking questions about bank accounts and insurance policies. That's part of the paranoia, Richard explained. She's suddenly convinced that I'm hiding money from her or planning to leave her destitute. It's textbook anxiety-induced delusion. The lawyer says it actually strengthens our case for guardianship. Financial paranoia is a classic symptom of cognitive decline. I listened to my husband and children plan my legal murder, because that's what guardianship would be, the death of my autonomy and identity, and felt the last vestiges of sentiment drain out of me like water from a broken pipe. They weren't just willing to let me die. They were actively working to make me disappear, either through cardiac failure or legal incapacitation. And they had convinced themselves that they were doing it out of love. But they had made one crucial mistake in their planning. They had assumed that Eleanor the accountant was gone forever, that 32 years of diminishment had erased her completely. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The next morning, while Richard was at his golf game and the children were sleeping in, I drove to Cindy Burns' office for an emergency meeting. I need to accelerate our timeline, I told her, playing the recordings I'd collected over the Thanksgiving weekend. They're planning to have me declared incompetent, and placed under legal guardianship. Cindy listened to the recordings with increasing amazement, occasionally pausing to take notes or ask for clarification about voices and contexts. "Mrs. Hoffman," she said when the recordings finished, "what you've documented here goes far beyond normal divorce proceedings. This is conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and possibly attempted murder. We need to involve law enforcement." "Not yet," I said firmly. "If we bring in police now, Richard will destroy evidence and claim I'm having paranoid delusions. We need to let him make the first move so we can prove criminal intent. That's extremely dangerous. If they're serious about the guardianship petition, then we'll be ready for them. But Cindy, I want to destroy them completely. I want Richard to lose everything, his reputation, his assets, his freedom. I want my children to understand exactly what they participated in. And I want it all to be legal, documented, and irreversible." Cindy studied me for a long moment, and I could see her recalibrating her assessment of her client. I wasn't the fragile, dependent wife who had walked into her office 6 weeks ago. I was a woman with a mission and the skills to accomplish it. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "File the divorce papers, but don't serve them yet. I want everything ready to go, but I want to choose the timing. And I want you to prepare a full forensic accounting report that documents every asset, every account, and every financial transaction from the past 5 years. That's going to be expensive. I have access to all the financial records, and I'm going to do most of the work myself. I just need your firm's name on the official documentation." Cindy smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "Mrs. Hoffman, I think you might be the most dangerous client I've ever represented." "Good," I said, "because I'm about to become the most expensive mistake Richard Hoffman ever made." Over the next 3 weeks, I became a woman with 2 lives. During the day, I played the role of the confused, dependent wife who was clearly struggling with post-cardiac cognitive issues. I asked the same questions multiple times, forgot conversations we'd supposedly had, and expressed anxiety about tasks I'd been managing competently for decades. Richard was delighted with my deterioration. Each episode of confusion was carefully documented in a journal he kept, along with photos of burned dinners, misplaced items, and other evidence of my declining capabilities. He shared these developments with Sarah and Michael in regular phone calls that I recorded from extension phones throughout the house. But at night, while Richard slept peacefully next to me, I became Eleanor the forensic accountant. I traced every financial transaction, identified every hidden account, and discovered patterns of financial behavior that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning our entire marriage. What I found was worse than simple asset hiding. Richard had been preparing for our eventual divorce for years, long before my heart attack gave him the idea of managing me to death instead. He had been transferring money to accounts I didn't know about, purchasing assets in business names that couldn't be traced back to our marriage, and building a financial fortress that would have left me with almost nothing if I had tried to leave him through conventional divorce proceedings. But Richard had made the classic mistake of criminals throughout history. He had underestimated his victim. Every transaction he thought was hidden, I found. Every asset he thought was protected, I traced. Every lie he had told me about our financial situation, I documented with bank records and investment statements that told the real story. We weren't worth $23 million. We were worth over $42 million, and Richard had been systematically hiding nearly half of our wealth for more than a decade. The man who had convinced me that I was financially dependent on him had actually been financially dependent on my unpaid labor, while simultaneously stealing from our shared assets to prepare for the day when he no longer wanted to be married to me. I was furious, but I was also professionally satisfied. This was the kind of complex financial detective work that I had loved about forensic accounting, and I was very good at it. By the middle of December, I had assembled a complete picture of our real financial situation, documented Richard's fraud in excruciating detail, and collected hours of recorded evidence of his plans to have me declared incompetent or dead. I was ready for war. The final battle began on December 18th, when Richard announced that he had scheduled an appointment for me with a new cardiologist, Dr. Patrick, who specialized in anxiety-related cardiac issues. "Dr. Martinez thinks you might benefit from a different approach to your treatment," he explained over breakfast, not meeting my eyes. Dr. Patrick has experience with patients who've developed complications after cardiac events. I knew immediately that Dr. Patrick was part of the conspiracy, the cardiologist who would declare me mentally incompetent due to cardiac-related cognitive decline, providing the medical foundation for Richard's guardianship petition. That sounds wonderful, I said with the vague gratitude of someone who was relieved to have medical decisions made for her. When is the appointment? Tomorrow at 10. I'll drive you, of course. That night I called Cindy Byrne. It's time, I said. They're making their move tomorrow. Are you sure you want to do this? Once we start, there's no going back. Cindy, I said, looking around the bedroom where I had slept next to a man who had been planning my death for months. There was no going back the moment he decided I was worth more dead than alive. The next morning I dressed carefully in a soft blue sweater and comfortable pants, the kind of outfit that said harmless invalid. I was planning to give the performance of my lifetime, and costume was crucial. Richard drove me to Dr. Patrick's office in downtown Chicago, keeping up a steady stream of concerned commentary about my health and behavior. I responded with appropriate confusion and gratitude, playing the role of the dependent wife who was lucky to have such a caring husband. Dr. Patrick's office was modern and sterile, with a kind of aggressively calming decor that was supposed to put anxious patients at ease. Dr. Patrick himself was a thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair, and the slightly condescending bedside manner of someone who specialized in treating people he considered inherently unreliable. The appointment began exactly as I had expected. Dr. Patrick asked me a series of questions designed to demonstrate cognitive impairment, and I answered them with just the right level of confusion and anxiety to confirm his preconceptions. When he asked me to remember 3 words and repeat them back after 5 minutes, I forgot one of them. When he asked me to draw a clock face, I made it slightly irregular. When he asked about my medications, I expressed confusion about dosages and timing. Richard sat in the corner, occasionally adding helpful details about my episodes and concerning behaviors at home. His performance was flawless, the devoted husband who was trying desperately to care for his deteriorating wife. After 45 minutes of this charade, Dr. Patrick sat back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone whose diagnosis had been confirmed. Mrs. Hoffman, he said gently, I'm concerned about some cognitive changes that seem to have developed since your cardiac event. It's not uncommon for patients to experience anxiety, memory problems, and difficulty with daily tasks after heart attacks. Is it serious? I asked, allowing my voice to tremble slightly. It's manageable with the right care and supervision, but I do think you would benefit from a more structured environment where your medical needs can be monitored more closely. What kind of environment? Richard asked, though we all knew he already had the answer. There are excellent residential facilities that specialize in cardiac rehabilitation and cognitive support. Places where Mrs. Hoffman could receive round-the-clock medical supervision while participating in activities designed to maintain her remaining cognitive function. Remaining cognitive function was a beautifully cruel phrase. It implied that most of my cognitive function was already gone, and that the goal was simply to preserve whatever scraps were left. Would that be permanent? I asked hesitantly. Dr. Patrick and Richard exchanged a look that was supposed to be subtle but felt like a knife between my shoulder blades. We would monitor your progress, of course, Dr. Patrick said, but in my experience, patients with your constellation of symptoms tend to require long-term care. I see. I sat quietly for a moment, as if processing this devastating news. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. Dr. Patrick, I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong, how much is my husband paying you to declare me incompetent? The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Dr. Patrick's face went white, and Richard half stood from his chair. Ellie, what are you? I'm asking Dr. Patrick about the financial arrangement you two have made to provide false medical testimony for your guardianship petition. I held up the recorder so they could both see it clearly. I'm also wondering if he's aware that conspiracy to commit fraud is a felony in Illinois. Dr. Patrick's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Richard's face had gone from surprise to furious. Ellie, you're having another episode. Dr. Patrick is trying to help you. Dr. Patrick is committing medical fraud, I said calmly. And you're committing elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. I reached into my purse again and pulled out a thick manila envelope. This contains copies of financial records documenting your theft of over $18 million in marital assets over the past decade. It also contains transcripts of recorded conversations in which you discuss strategies for hastening my death through stress management and medical neglect. Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a live snake. The original documents are in the hands of my attorney, along with copies that have been forwarded to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, the Cook County District Attorney's Office, and the Chicago Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit. I stood up and smoothed my sweater, feeling stronger than I had in 32 years. Dr. Patrick, I suggest you contact your attorney immediately. Your medical license is about to become the least of your problems. I turned to Richard, who was still frozen in his chair, staring at me as if I had just transformed into someone he didn't recognize. And Richard, I said with a smile that felt like sunshine after 32 years of winter, you've been served. I handed him the divorce papers that Cindy Byrne had prepared, along with a restraining order that prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of me or attempting to access any of our joint financial accounts. Your attorney should also inform you that I filed a civil lawsuit for financial fraud, elder abuse, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages I'm seeking exceed $4 million, which coincidentally is about what you'll need to pay for your criminal defense. Richard finally found his voice. You can't do this. You're sick, you're not thinking clearly. Dr. Patrick, tell her. Dr. Patrick won't be telling anyone anything, I interrupted. His medical license has been suspended pending investigation, and he's probably going to be too busy with his own legal problems to worry about yours. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to the two men who had planned my destruction. Oh, and Richard? Sarah and Michael have both been subpoenaed to testify about their knowledge of your plans. I hope you enjoyed Thanksgiving dinner, because it's the last family meal you'll ever have with any of us. I walked out of that office and into the Chicago winter sunshine, breathing freely for the first time in decades. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and personal reconstruction. Richard's arrest made the local news, and the story of the woman who uncovered her husband's murder plot by pretending to be mentally incompetent became a cautionary tale about elder abuse and financial fraud. Dr. Patrick lost his medical license and was sentenced to 3 years in prison for medical fraud and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The patient advocate Jennifer received 2 years for her role in the conspiracy to interfere with my medical care. Richard was sentenced to 7 years for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy. His business collapsed under the weight of the scandal, and his reputation in Chicago's financial community was destroyed completely. Sarah and Michael both testified against their father in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Sarah moved back to Chicago and has been slowly rebuilding our relationship, though it will never be what it was before she decided I was worth more dead than alive. Michael relocated to Portland and sends occasional emails, but we haven't spoken directly since the trial. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court for $38 million, plus the return of all assets Richard had hidden during our marriage. I ended up with over $6 million, 2 houses, and a portfolio of investments that generate enough income to support me comfortably for the rest of my life. But more importantly, I got myself back. I completed the forensic accounting certification program that Jack Patterson had recommended, and I now work as a consultant specializing in divorce-related financial fraud. It turns out that Richard wasn't unusual. There are thousands of spouses out there systematically hiding assets and preparing for the day when their partners become inconvenient. I help other women uncover the truth about their financial situations, and I've become something of an expert in recognizing the signs of financial abuse in long-term marriages. My clients are women who thought they knew their husbands, who trusted completely and discovered that trust was being used as a weapon against them. I live now in a smaller house in Oak Park, close enough to the city for work but far enough away that I never accidentally run into Richard's old colleagues or the social circle that knew me only as his dependent wife. My new house is mine alone. I bought it with my own money, decorated it to my own taste, and filled it with books and music and colors that make me happy. I have new friends who know me as Eleanor the forensic accountant, not Ellie the wife. I travel when I want to, work as much or as little as I choose, and make every decision about my life based on what I want rather than what someone else expects from me. My heart is stronger now than it was before the attack. The cardiologist I chose myself, Dr. Sarah Kim, a brilliant woman who treats me like an intelligent adult rather than a helpless child, says my cardiac function has improved significantly since I eliminated the major source of stress from my life. Divorce, she told me with a wry smile, is often the best cardiac medication. I think about Richard sometimes, though not often and never with regret. I think about the 32 years I spent making myself smaller to accommodate his ego, and I feel something that might be pity for the man who was so threatened by his wife's competence that he tried to have her killed rather than risk her independence. But mostly I think about the future. At 62, I'm financially secure, professionally accomplished, and personally free in ways I never imagined possible. I have work that challenges me, friends who value me, and a life that belongs entirely to me. The heart attack that Richard saw as an opportunity to get rid of me became the catalyst for me to get rid of him. The weakness he tried to exploit became the source of my greatest strength. I used to believe that love meant sacrifice, that marriage required me to disappear into someone else's life, that my worth was measured by how well I served other people's needs. I used to think that asking for help was selfish, that expecting support was demanding too much, that accepting neglect was part of being a good wife. But now I know that real love enhances rather than diminishes, that healthy relationships make both people stronger rather than requiring one person to become smaller. I know that my worth is intrinsic rather than earned, that my needs matter as much as anyone else's, and that settling for less than I deserve is not virtuous, it's just settling. The chest pain that hit me in Target was my heart's way of telling me that something was desperately wrong with my life. I thought it was a medical emergency that needed to be survived. It turned out to be an opportunity that needed to be seized. Richard left me at the emergency room during my heart attack because he thought I was dying and he wanted to get on with his life. I left him at the mercy of my divorce lawyer because I was finally ready to start living mine.